the 19th of August, 1941. We are woken by the sounds of wild shooting. Alarm! Enemy tanks! Alarm! Enemy tanks! We stumble out of the tent, but by then an anti-tank gun on the left has made short work of the Russian tank. It is already burning. It is becoming quiet again, so we crawl back into the tent to catch some more sleep. Half an hour later, however, the shooting starts again. This time it's an anti-tank gun in an advanced position which is firing. Out of the tent again. There is a civilian car in the field about 500 meters away. It was shot up by Lopez Panzer IV, who at the time had taken fire from a hidden anti-tank gun in the forest on the other side of the field. The combined fire of everything the company has to offer seems to have silenced that Russian gun, but it has to be pointed out that our scouts had reported that the forest was free of the enemy. After they had left, the Russians had seemingly moved back in. Now we could catch up with some much-needed sleep until 8 o'clock. It was a beautiful day. I couldn't help thinking that yesterday's attack had cost another young and flourishing life. The dispatch rider had found Matusik and had brought him back to the company, where he reported that his crew was unhurt. In the other crew, however, Unteroffizier Dahlmann had been slightly wounded, and Bussmann, his gunner, severely wounded. Gefreiter Maschauser had been killed. Albert had been lucky and was completely unharmed. There had been Russians lying in the grass only 15 meters ahead of their tank. As soon as Maschauser had bailed out, he had been shot through the head and was killed immediately. A firefight developed in which Dahlmann and Albert desperately tried to defend themselves with their pistols, and it was only when Albert gunned down one of the Russians that the situation changed. The Russian had been in the process of throwing a grenade, and after he had been shot down, this detonated in his hand, shredding his lower abdomen and causing the others to withdraw. More mail arrived on Tuesday. We were staying in an old barn which we had furnished to quite a comfortable standard. Later that day, after having drawn rations from the field kitchens, Oris and I walked down to where the 2 destroyed tanks were standing to find and bury Maschauser. A recovery vehicle had arrived from the field workshop, and Kopman and Korn had already wrapped Maschauser's body in a tent square, removed some private items from his pockets, and had broken his dog tag. We carried Maschauser back to the road and then dug him a grave under a tree next to a bunker. One of the tank mechanics had found a few flowers in one of the shot-up houses at Kloppesy. Each of us threw 3 shovels of earth onto the grave. We then placed his black cap on top of the birchwood cross, and thus added to the many such monuments which adorn the graves of bold and brave panzer gunners. It compels us to further, relentless commitment. His death will not remain unpunished. In one of the bushes there were the dead bodies of a Russian captain, that of a first lieutenant and that of a commissar. In total, more than 20 corpses lay around the destroyed tank. A wounded Russian was also lying there, still with his rifle in his hand. He didn't react when I ordered him to raise his arms. I shot him myself. I did the same to another who was lying in a foxhole closer to the tank and who pretended to be dead when I told him to stand up. Are they acting in that manner because they are afraid of us, or out of deceit? If it's the first reason, then the commissars are to blame for the death of those men. If it's the latter, well, they deserve it. I remember the incident with Oberleutnant Bethke a few weeks ago. We had just finished decorating Maschauser's grave with the flowers and the cross, when 6 Russian fighters flew in, accompanied by a few bombers. Then we witnessed how one of the bombers was shot down, and a minute later a Rata came flying back, trailing a thick cloud of smoke. That Rata then seemed to be going down on the airfield which we had passed by a day earlier. For a moment we were cheering the event, but not for long, as, soon after, a whole swarm of Ratas plunged down from the sky and came at us in a low-level attack. That didn't have any effect, and they flew away. All except one, which returned, flew a few turns, and then initiated a landing on the airfield, after which it vanished from sight behind a hedgerow. He was obviously trying to pick up his comrade, so we rushed down there as quickly as we could. Most men headed there on the half-tracked recovery vehicle, while ours had hitched a ride on a dispatch rider's motorbike that had been standing on the side of the road. I ran over using my long legs. Upon arrival, we could see that the first machine was standing way too far away, while the second one was already in the process of taking off again. At that moment, I heard a bang from the direction of the road, from around a bend where, according to some nearby infantry, Ores had headed with his motorbike. Albert, Koppe, Voss and I started running down the road towards the bend. From a distance already we could see a small black spot on the road. That had to be his motorbike. I was carrying a Russian machine pistol, while the others all had their pistols, and together we now advanced carefully up the roadside. The first thing that caught my eye were several dead Russians, and I realized immediately that these men had stepped on mines. Now we had to be very careful. Now, only a short while later, all that feels unreal to me, so distant and improbable. But the sight of those Russian corpses, unburied by their comrades, and only hastily covered with a few branches due to the fear of mines, somehow increased the gravity and seriousness of the situation. Albert Berscheid and Renger, who had been following behind, crossed over to the right side of the road. Slowly and with crouched bodies, we walked through the minefield, our eyes peeled on the ground and watching every step, getting closer and closer to the motorbike. There was a man lying there. He was waving to us. Now we had to be fast. Quick help was needed. We started running. No one was firing on us. Only a day before there had been heavy fighting at this spot. When we had finally reached the motorbike, we could see the whole mess before us. The dispatch rider and Ores had driven over a mine. The whole road was covered with mines. There was no sign of Ores. Only his cap and his pistol were lying on the ground, together with some parts of the motorbike. And the driver himself, I could hardly look at him. So ghastly was the wound on the poor boy's leg. The mangled bones of his lower leg were sticking out of a lump of shredded flesh, and the whole bloody mass was attached to his upper leg only by a thin strip of sinew and flesh. He had deep wounds on his arms as well, all of them full of splinters, and his artery had been cut as well. With the leather strap of the machine pistol and a muslin bandage, I first created a makeshift ligature for his leg, and hurried to finish before the blood vessels, contracted by shock, started bleeding again. I also started bandaging the wounds on his arms, but then I ran out of bandages. Koppe, Albert and Voss didn't want to help binding his wounds. Their nerves couldn't take it, and admittedly, the sight of the blood-covered soldier was anything but nice. It was, to put it simply, absolutely horrible. The boy conducted himself impeccably. He said that he would be happy if he'd be allowed to keep his hands and the one leg. He remained conscious throughout, and his pain must have been terrible. He asked me to cut off the lower leg. I only had a pocket knife with me, but I tried it nevertheless. The wounded boy watched me doing it, but as it hurt him too much, I gave up the attempts to amputate with my primitive tools. Voss was white as a corpse when he watched me bandaging the boy. There are many people out there who can't bear watching something like this. We then placed the wounded boy on a blanket, which we unbuckled from his motorbike, and then started carrying him to the recovery vehicle, which stood waiting behind the bend of the road, quite some distance away. But then wham! Damn it to hell. The recovery vehicle had also hit a mine. A crash, a huge cloud of dust, and the vehicle stood still. We had failed to spot the anti-tank mine barrier up there when we had advanced on foot. With 3 carriers and a distance of over 1 kilometre to cover, a wounded man can get very heavy indeed. But we were lucky and managed to reach the recovery vehicle. We carefully placed the wounded boy on the vehicle and secured his body with rubber straps. Unteroffizier Albert then carefully dug up a mine located behind the vehicle, which allowed it to reverse. It was still in working order, although the driver had a deep cut in his scalp. Albert, Koppe and I then went back to look for Feldwebel Auras, or at least some traces of him. We searched everything as well as we could, even walked to the airfield to search the buildings located on it. There was no sign of Ores. When we walked back, we took a pile of blankets from a Russian artillery limber which had run onto a mine. We were concerned about Ores, fearing that he had fallen into the hands of the Reds. But, knowing Ores, there was always the possibility that he had fought his way back to the road himself. As we walked back, we suddenly heard a fusillade of shots in front of us from the right side of the road. Carefully, we advanced through the undergrowth on the left roadside until we spotted a group of men on the road. Matusik, Hauptmann Fahrer, and a few of my men. Lots of talking followed. What had happened to the recovery vehicle, and how lucky its crew had been when it had run over the mine. But it was mostly Hauptmann Fahrer who did the talking. It was also Fahrer who, after looking at the Russian machine pistol that I was carrying, suddenly told me to get away from him. One of those things had just gone off in his hand, all by itself. He then asked why the hell I had walked into the minefield. By then I was livid with anger, and replied that all those who had seen their fair share of action from the start would know the answer to that question, and that everyone else would be better advised to shut up. In the aftermath, that reply led to a joint meeting with Hiller, where Fahrer withdrew his accusation and even offered me his hand in friendship. I ended it there as I had no intention of taking this any further. The 23rd of August, 1941. I am sitting in a cottage which is owned by an old Estonian woman. We have to stay here all night. I don't know what the plan for tomorrow will be, but we know that we will be deployed somewhere else. The current situation is as follows. Together with Voraussabteilung Limbrun, our 5th Company has driven the advance of the division further towards the northeast, where it is now only 45 kilometers away from Leningrad and only 35 kilometers from the coast. We are not advancing any further north, as the main road ahead of us is already in range of the Russian coastal artillery. That we want to avoid having our hides tanned by those big buggers which can rotate their guns 360 degrees is pretty clear. We'll defeat the Russians anyway. Our attack stalled in front of Luga. There the 8th Panzer Division has turned southeast towards the Luga, while 1 and 6th Panzer Division are defending towards the north for as long as it takes to clear the situation and to get rid of the Russian divisions there. Some of our recce squads have managed to advance within 5 kilometers of Peterhof. The only Russian soldier they could find there was a courier, who was of course taken prisoner by them. He had been on the way from Luga to Leningrad. All along the defensive line, the Russians launch regular small unit attacks, that is all. Some tiny village nearby was suddenly attacked by 4 tanks and 250 Russians. 4 tanks were destroyed and 160 Russians finished off. We can also feel the effect of the many airfields in this region. Bombers and Ratas come to visit often. Only 500 meters from here, some Ratas have only recently strafed a vehicle of the artillery. Of the 12 Ratas, not a single one was shot down, but they in turn nearly sent one of our Messerschmitts to the ground, which had been escorting one of our Focke-Wulf reconnaissance aircraft. Today, Abteilung 65 came through the village. Abteilung had a Russian tank with them, weight 48 tons, armed with a 7.62 centimeters gun and 2 more guns in smaller turrets. A huge bucket. We just received supplies including half-litre of schnapps, chocolate and 150 litres of beer for the company. Not bad at all. But let me talk about what else happened in the last few days. On Wednesday, the 20th of August, 1941, we moved into a defensive position, but nothing happened. We rolled back into a forest behind Gorky, where we settled down and made our home for the next 8 days. We dug a square-shaped hole and covered it with wooden beams, which would serve as protection against shell splinters. We also gathered some fresh hay, which smelled wonderful, and on which we then had a good night's sleep. But on Thursday, the 21st of August, Oberst Koll ordered us to move. We were all feeling very sorry for ourselves. We moved into a forest outside Kaladeri, tall pine trees without any undergrowth. It started to rain. No Russians in sight. On that evening, Oberst Koll briefed us about the situation here in the east. Even if I am not at home by the 31st of August, we will surely have taken Leningrad soon. On Friday, the 22nd of August, we moved from the high forest to another place nearby, where, together with the Riflemen, we formed the mobile reserve of Kampfgruppe von Seckendorf. In the worst case, our tanks could carry a whole company of riflemen. During the night, we heard the sound of intense shooting in the distance, but were not committed ourselves. Sunday, the 24th of August, 1941. I am again sitting in the house of the old Estonian woman. Our tank is parked right next to it. Thunderstorms and rain have driven us all indoors. In one corner of the room, another woman is delousing a child. She does so with a kind of religious devotion. Glasgow and Ritgen have just been over, and shortly before that, Theo Langenbruch was here to collect his mail. An Unteroffizier of the flak was here too. He wanted to have me as witness for his destruction of a Po-2 aircraft. He is stationed 50 meters away from here. The flak is now firing armor-piercing shot at some of the more heavily armored Russian aircraft. Several new types have made an appearance, including some modern bombers and fighters. Now that it's raining, we won't get any more visitors. No one really knows what we'll do next. The general situation isn't too bad for us. Voroshilov has issued a statement in which he orders his people to stock up on food supplies. The circle around Leningrad is slowly closing. Again, we are the division which is at the forefront of it all. Otherwise, nothing new. Last night was freezing cold. Just now, 6 Russian fighters zoomed over, even though it was raining. Everything and everyone opened up on them. Since Verdecker has brought down that Russian fighter with his Russian gun, everyone else seems to be determined to copy that feat. Monday, the 25th of August, 1941. Our rest has come to an end. We have just been subordinated to 8 Panzer Division and are to march out together with Battalion Zollenkopf and a light artillery unit. There seems to be work for us again. I wonder where. I hope it will help to close the door of this shop a bit sooner. Yesterday evening it was reported that Luga had fallen. I don't know yet if that is true. I wish it was. It would be nice. The entire sky in that direction was illuminated by huge fires last night. The horizon was bathed in blood-red colours. It is only good that the war isn't waged on German soil, as it was in the 30 Years' War. Last night was very cold again. Makes me wonder how the weather will develop in the future. I hope there will be less rain than we had during the last few days. The daytime heat is much better to bear than the freezing cold of the nights. One can't find any sleep, just tossing and turning in an attempt to keep warm. Today is the 25th, and I personally doubt that Leningrad will be fully encircled in 6 days. Maybe that's what they'll be employing us for. Maybe it is us who are supposed to close the lock. But I need to stop thinking about ifs and whens. There is no sense in that. Yesterday evening I washed my clothes in a waterhole nearby, and the results were better than those usually achieved by the Russian women, and it didn't need the usual payment of a loaf of army bread. While I was doing that, Feldwebel Ulrich came to see me to say goodbye. He is being transferred to Neuling's company. Since the time at Godov, I really came to like Ulrich. Before that, I had hardly known him. I cannot help thinking about the fighting for the field positions at Konochowizy, Chimosowo and Muratowo. I wonder where Comrade Bongart is now. 2 months we have been out here now, and who knows how much longer it is going to take. In the future, we have to watch that not so many houses go up in flames during the firefights. Otherwise, we won't have anywhere to sleep. There are now broadsheets on the wells and other public places with calls to bring in the harvest. The farmers here were already busy harvesting before the damned rain started. My platoon has 5 vehicles again. Feldwebel Gobler joined us yesterday, together with Feldwebel Engelhardt. My other commanders are Unteroffizier Grohr and Albert. The company now has 18 Skodas and the radio vehicle of the regiment. 3 platoons of 5 Skodas each, 2 in the company squad. The said radio vehicle and Wilhelm Loper's platoon of 3 Panzer IV. We are now waiting in Nikolskoye. The vehicles are lined up alongside the houses and are well camouflaged. The boss has driven off to find out what he is supposed to do with us. Earlier we drove through a village, Natsashuka, which was inhabited by a strikingly northern type of people. Most certainly Finns or Germans, women and children with long, beautiful faces, light blue eyes and white blonde hair. Clearly not of Russian or Slavic descent. We were astounded to see gardens, even beautifully kept gardens with nicely painted fences. I wonder how these people managed to survive out here. Their fields were the best we had seen in the whole region. Nikolskoye has been virtually abandoned by the people, but it is a clean village with a neat church made from stone. On its spire, of which half is sadly missing, sits our artillery observer, who is guiding the fire of our 15 centimetres guns onto some Russian railway stations ahead of us. Not much else going on here. We are to establish a defensive line. What is our next task? We don't yet know. I wonder what news the boss will bring. Wednesday, the 27th of August, 1941, Pokruka. in front of Krasnogvardeysk. Yesterday I couldn't write any more. Hiller, Farah, Lope, me and the other platoon leaders had been called to a briefing with Oberst Zollenkopf to discuss the further deployment of our company. We are defending a line facing beaten Russian troops flooding back from Luga. Our positions are widely dispersed. In the gaps between, Spiekermann, the leader of Zollenkopf's pioneer platoon, has installed a number of treats: mines, booby traps, spring guns. Yesterday evening, after a strong artillery preparation, about 600 Russians attacked from the direction of Krasnogvardeysk. As usual, they were repelled and suffered heavy casualties. In general, the casualties of the Reds are absolutely enormous, and when one speaks to the workers here, well, they think in the same way as our workers do. In a lost war, the working population suffers most. Am I too much of a materialist if I claim that the upper levels of the population can bear the loss of their ideational values much better than the working class can bear their material loss? That's saying it carefully. I don't want to be classed as a Bolshevist, but my socialist Weltanschauung is only strengthened by this war. Only when it comes to me, the international social ideology is replaced by a strong nationalist direction with an emphasis on the racial stance. The political perspective of the Lancers has been much widened by this campaign in particular. I have now left the front porch and fled outside. Even though it is a bit drafty out here, I have escaped the company of the mutineers in my platoon. Spilken, Grohr, Schweinsberg, Obergefreiter with 4 years of service, Koch the roofer, all as bad as each other. Grohr in particular is one of the eternally colourless. Quite a good comrade, but politically not quite plus and not quite minus either. People such as this, without a clear position, have always existed, especially after the last war. They have quickly taken advantage of a secure bourgeois existence, but they have gained just as much as they have dared, not much at all. Particularly so when it comes to intellectual matters. In contrast, men like Bill Veit, Peter Koolhaas and Rudi Gerke have spent 14 years of their lives with 1 foot in a fortress prison cell. They have been despised by the glutted citizens, while they themselves were forced to live from hand to mouth, marked down by society as failed existences. But it was them who helped to shape and create a new enormous Reich, and that monumental thought and the satisfaction that arises from it is worth so much more than quietly munching one's middle-class cabbage bought with a secure union wage. Now then, enough of politics. We have to move out soon. I have just seen the boss. We'll have to shift our positions a little bit further to the right. Why? Only the stars know the answer. This kind of thing doesn't bother me anymore. I have become just as stubborn as all the other Lancers have become. Yesterday evening, when it had just become dark, we had to move houses, even though we had only just moved into what seemed to be the only waterproof house in the village. And now, just because the battered riflemen need something to lean on, I have to move my 5 laughable tanks. And then they were still so jumpy that one of their sentries opened fire on one of my men when he was busy following a call of nature that night. Good that the comrade wasn't able to hit anything, and even better that most of our Lancers are a lot more relaxed. It is strange how one can write down all the little details one experiences on quiet days. What we experience on days of combat, however, those details one does remember, but somehow it is hard to write them down. The faces of the Russians who surrendered after the close fighting during the attack on Konochowizy, the expression of the man who lay next to my tank and threw the hand grenade, even though he was already looking into the barrel of my pistol and only a fleeting second before I shot him dead. One cannot really express all this on paper. Then the Russian tanks appeared. I warned Wenger via the radio. Eject the high-explosive shell, load armor-piercing, the deadly serious face of Wittkotter when the gun suddenly jammed, 3 enemy tanks ahead which could have ended us then and there. I will never be able to forget that. The expressions on the faces of the riflemen, weapons in hand, machine guns ready, riding on the tank during some fighting advance through a forest, the constant watch for ratas in the sky. All this I will not forget. But I can't describe it properly either. I have seen photographs of men attacking across a river in assault boats. They looked like our own riflemen when they advanced towards the Russian bunkers at Arokyuli. Feldwebel Westhoff of the Kradschützen with his small moustache and the machine gunner of his platoon, who just stood there in front of the foxholes, his machine gun at the hip, keeping the heads of the Russians down with his scything fire. The two men I supplied with hand grenades, which they then used to smoke out a Russian bunker. They all had the same hard, stony faces and tense expression. The same as mine, I guess, when we stood in front of the Russians and our guns failed to work. This evening I was visited by Oberleutnant Schneider, the adjutant of Nebelabteilung and former member of IR 37. After the episode at Poritschir, where we guarded his position, he was decorated with the EK-1. He deserves it, and the award is not begrudged by anyone. He does a fantastic job as a forward observer for his unit. Leonhardt has informed me that Oberleutnant Bethke is going to be transferred as an instructor to the Waffenschule in Wunsdorf. The ideal job for him. There he'll be reunited with Aschauer, Rink and the other boys of our company. I wonder how they feel, now that they are freshly baked Unteroffizier. We have supplied them all with the attestations needed for the assault badge. Currently there is a very peaceful atmosphere here, just like in one of those forest villages near Hamburg at this time of year. The Russian artillery is silent, and smoke from the evening fires rises into the clear evening sky from the chimneys of the clean wooden houses. I can't help thinking about Jochen Mollenberg, about Kleinjung, Wielbaum and Gunther Eggers. They will walk with us, be among us again. I still can't reconcile myself with it. Friday, the 29th of August, 1941. After the Russian night attack on Sivyoskaya, we have been deployed here to the 3rd Company of the Riflemen. Now I sit here in the doorway of a big stone-built barn, which offers some protection against splinters. I am dog-tired, but I do want to try to describe what has happened. At 8 p.m. I was called to the boss for a briefing. Although he was still away with Zollenkopf, he had left a whole bunch of instructions for us. We were supposed to move our whole defence unit further towards the south into the wake of the advancing 8th Panzer Division. The crews stood at their vehicles and were ready to move out, but I had to wait for Hiller, who only arrived back at 10 p.m., but when he arrived he brought us the news that we had been given more time and were only to march out at 03:15 before the break of dawn. Then we would drive to Sivyoskaya to relieve elements of 8th Panzer Division. After having slept from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., we then marched out into the pouring rain. Totally tired and soaking wet, we arrived at Sivyosk and were lucky enough to find quarters in an empty and quite exquisite house. The house was uninhabited. Using the hay from an adjacent barn, we made beds for ourselves and the crews in the rooms on both floors of the house, and then caught up with some much-needed sleep. I made my bed on a quite excellent sofa in the living room. Before that, we had lit the stove and then slept wonderfully well, even though we were roused from it several times by the usual interruptions. Platoon leaders to the boss. Vehicle strength report requested. And similar malarkey. We inspected the positions of the rifle company, and then, accompanied by Lope and his tanks, drove to the glass factory, the name of which I have forgotten. It is located alongside a lake and was once built by Germans. A lieutenant of the Geheime Feldpolizei, who had been born in that village, was just then visiting the house he had been born in. The section there is held by Oberleutnant Stocker, who was still asleep when we arrived because it had taken him and his vehicles the whole night to get there. One of his vehicles had driven into a roadside ditch and had become stuck there. He didn't see the need to get up when we appeared and greeted us like some old dame, lying on the bed. He has always been a little braggart. We left Lope's lot in another small village and then drove to another place where Farah and Hiller wanted to organise some meat. But there was no livestock and not even a single egg to be had, as the population of the village with the glass factory, who were all factory workers and did not own any ground or livestock, had to be supplied by the surrounding villages. The situation in the area was similar to famine. Hundreds of people were queuing for hours in front of vehicles from which bread was being distributed. In stark contrast to our situation at home, no one in Russia has wasted even a thought about securing the provision of the non-combatant population. We talked to a worker who spoke fluent German. He said that of the original German workforce, only an old man in his 70s remained. Until recently, he had still been the best-paid worker. Now he received a pension of 102 rubles, but then he had earned 700 rubles. That's 70 marks in German currency. We took a look at a church in a neighbouring village which had been turned into some kind of dance club. That was also something the worker had also told us about. Only the old people were still living their orthodox religion. The young were growing up without any religion at all, and felt good about it. Inside the Red Club, they had hung big cloths with the faces of Stalin, Lenin, Voroshilov, Kalinin, and other Soviet dignitaries. They were hanging right above the old and much smaller images of the saints. I was shocked at the scruffy appearance of the workers. Even before 1933, no one in Germany had looked that shabby. We then drove back to the glass factory, stopping briefly at Lopez's position, where someone had managed to source a few scraps on fresh veal, of which some was handed to Hiller. I took the time to rummage through some of the nearby houses. Communal kitchen, sports hall, a food and housekeeping shop, all grouped together there. All very practical and, in my opinion, the right thing to do from a socialist perspective. Maybe it's because of the army that I'm such a friend of communal cooking. Just the right thing for the employed communal kitchen and cooperative society. But there is no space for individualism, just one of many arguments against all this. On our way back, we were overtaken by Zollenkopf's adjutant, who told us that there was something brewing in Siviosk. We drove back as fast as we could, but not without bartering half a dozen eggs from a Finnish woman in return for half an army loaf. Everyone is on high alert. The stolen chicken is out of the pots, the fried potatoes taken off the fire, and then to the vehicles on high alert. After we had waited for a while, however, we unpacked all of the food again and ate it all nevertheless. Then it got dark and we deployed the sentries. Then the first news came in. A Finn had reported that he had seen large numbers of Russian troops advancing through the forest towards our position. Soon after, a Russian defector was brought in, and with him came more important information. He told us that at first they had wanted to defect with the entire company. His comrades, however, had been too scared of their superiors, and had, at the last moment, decided to stay behind. Everyone had been in a depressed mood, but that morning they would be attacking the village. One Russian battalion would attack from the left, while another would bypass the village and then attack from the right. A third Russian battalion would be kept in reserve. There were no tanks, but they had been promised artillery support. Based on that report, all rifle pickets were withdrawn. In the cover of darkness, the baggage was sent to the rear, and then our tanks, anti-tank guns, flak and riflemen were formed into a main defensive line on both sides of the river near the road. My platoon, together with Feldwebel Dreyer, was deployed on the left. Section commander was Oberleutnant Prince. Trying to get through the vehicles of the withdrawing baggage train, it took us from 11 a.m. to 11:45 a.m. to cover a distance of only 1 kilometre. Obergefreiter Koch, a man of Albert's crew, was caught between two tanks, badly bruised on the hips, and as such hors de combat. We placed him on a bed in one of the houses where he remained until dawn, shortly before the Russian attack, when a dispatch rider of the Riflemen took him to a doctor. Even though it was dark, we had found good positions where, well camouflaged, we remained until the daybreak. Feldwebel Dreyer's tank had to pull the vehicles of the flak from the wet and soggy field, and then took position on our right wing, leaning against the edge of the village. On my right, next to a house, there were Feldwebel Gobler, and next to him, linking up with Dreyer, Feldwebel Albert. On my left there was Feldwebel Engelhardt, who secured the road towards the left and behind him. To prevent any attempt to bypass and flank us, there was Unteroffizier Grohr. The gaps between our vehicles were filled by 1.5 centimetres and 3.7 centimetres anti-tank guns, several heavy machine guns, a platoon of 3.7 centimetres flak and a couple of additional 2 centimetres, self-propelled flak guns. The Russians could come if they wished to do so, and as it slowly got light, they came. All of a sudden my wet trouser legs and the freezing cold were forgotten. I was physically totally exhausted. I had been shivering all over in the freezing wet cold, and my already tired eyes had been hurting from staring into the darkness through my binoculars. But then, when I spotted dense waves of attacking Soviet infantry from a distance of 1 to 2 kilometres, all of that was suddenly forgotten. weapons ready, and one final check. Vitkotter was arming and sorting the ammunition. Wenger was busy working on the radio. I again checked all the weapons, unlocked the turret, and continued observing through my binoculars. And damn, there they came, huge numbers of them. One could see how the individual Russian companies stepped out of the forest from where they advanced, in an oblique angle, towards the village on the left. They advance in wide lines. Due to the rain, most had tent squares hanging over their heads and shoulders, and many were holding their rifles with one hand on the carrying straps. On the far right of the Russian line, one company stepped out of the forest a moment later, directly opposite us, but they also swerved towards the centre of the village. Everything was quiet, when suddenly a few single Russian soldiers appeared about 300 meters in front of us. And I don't know which idiot was so unnerved by it all that he decided to open fire on them, as it had been agreed that we'd only open fire at closest range. An MG-34 started hammering away, and then the infantry guns on our right, possibly on someone's order, also joined the untimely concert. Then the 3.7 flak started firing on some distant targets, while Unteroffizier Albert, somehow enticed by Hauptmann Farah, started firing on some single Russians. I was really angry. That way we had given away our new positions before having clipped even a single Russian hair. The effects of that folly could be felt shortly afterwards, when Russian artillery started falling around us, at least one 15 centimetres and a battery of 7.62 centimetres. Some Russians were now approaching and entering the village, and our artillery started shelling it. Soon the house of our neighbour there, the carpenter, started burning. A pity. The man had been very kind to us. Most of the Russians had withdrawn when the firing started, and now, slowly but surely, the fire of both sides got weaker, and Hauptmann Farah appeared next to my tank. My radio, receiver and transmitter had stopped working, and he informed me that a battalion of tanks of 8 Panzer Division and a battalion of Kratschützen were on the way to kick the Russians out of the village. On the horizon, one could see a company of Russians laying mines in a potato field on the edge of the forest. I could clearly see one man holding a large white object, probably a map, who seemed to be guiding the operation. I am now sitting in the building housing the children's home, waiting for the things that are lying ahead. The rainfall has become weaker and, at least at the moment, the same applies to the artillery fire. I was interrupted several times while writing the above lines when heavy shells detonated nearby. I hope they'll spare us in the coming night. Unteroffizier Enz was here with the field kitchens. He brought news from Hiller. After clearing the village, the tanks of 8 Panzer had pulled out again. 40 prisoners had been rounded up there. They told us that a Russian recce squad in civilian clothing had been in the village yesterday and had come back with a detailed report. They had known that we were there, and with what strength. They had even known the location of Zollenkopf's command post. Feldwebel Giersig has been wounded by shell splinters and has to go to hospital. Another of our soldiers was sitting on the turret of a tank when a shell splinter tore through his trouser pocket and ripped away his wallet. Such luck. The Russians are firing again at the moment, 15 centimetres calibre. I am out of here. Saturday the 30th of August, 1941. Up until now, the Russian artillery hasn't fired on this place. Our troops must have captured Wirisi, and thus probably forced the Red batteries to withdraw from there. Thank God. That's the only thing one can say. Yesterday, during the barrage, the infantry gun platoon of the Riflemen suffered casualties, 2 killed and 4 severely wounded. And when I visited the communal smithy and the attached carpenter's workshop this morning, the men there were busy making a coffin for one of the civilian dead. We slept quite well last night, here in the kitchen of the children's home. We have been on alert, as it seemed that the Russians were planning another operation against our little village. Our sentries had reported that they had heard faint sounds, similar to that of Morse code. They had seen light signals in the distance, but they hadn't seen a single living being. Yesterday evening the weather was brilliant, but in the morning it started to rain again, and up until now it has been miserable all day. I can make good use of the rubber boots which I have brought from Siwiosk. They are big misshapen things with felt shafts, of the kind the farmers up here are wearing. Up here one can, at least I think so, tell the women apart by their clothing. The Finnish girls and women seem to tie the ends of the headscarves back around their necks in a way which covers part of their chins as well. The Russian women, on the other hand, just like those in Poland, simply tie theirs in a knot below the chin. This morning I was just sitting in my tank drinking coffee, when the mayor of the village walked past and was distributing flour. I sent Renga to take a look into the big barn, which had so far been locked. He returned and reported that the barn was more or less empty and only contained several radio headphones, a few food supplies, some old rubber tires, and old pots and pans. I decided to take a closer look at the headphones. The mayor explained to me that these had been left behind by members of the Red Club, but by then I had already switched my interest to the other barn and ordered it to be unlocked. Lo and behold, a box of English machine gun ammunition and about 100 bottles, Molotov cocktails, which the bastards had made themselves. The bottles contained an added layer of very fine tobacco, of the kind which was used for pest control on cabbage fields to aid the burning time. Rubber straps fashioned from old tires held the long phosphorus igniter. I was burning with rage and ordered the man to be brought to Comrade Helatat. He, being the village commander, would have to decide upon punishment after interrogation. What a bloody mess. If one isn't facing soldiers, then one has to cope with partisans. Only this morning, in the neighbouring village of Novosibirskaya, 2 women notified the Russians about one of our reconnaissance patrols. One of them has already been strung up on the sports field. The village itself has been turned to ashes, and the population has been rounded up on the village square. The most unbelievable things happened there. Entire Russian recon squads spent the night there. The women smuggled arms for the partisans, and we are giving them bread in return, even though we have hardly enough to feed ourselves and distribute the surplus grain of the kolkhozes among their workers. Only the good-natured German encounters problems such as this. Someone should shoot the whole lot of them. The 31st of August, 1941. It's my birthday today. I have been given a nice present. Oberst Zollenkopf has said to Hiller, and he passed on to me, that I tend to be too worried and careful when it comes to the deployment of my platoon. I have been sitting here for an hour now, trying to get these few lines onto paper, but I am so angry that I am not making any real progress. Such a disgrace, I will not forgive that any time soon. Angry as I am, there is no sense in me going on about this here, but I will repay in kind to Herr Zollenkopf one day. Just after I saw Hiller, I thought for a while about the whole thing. Then I went back to him and told him to run a complaint via official channels so that I could publicly make my case. Zollenkopf, however, was not in his command post. Hiller listened to everything again, but advised me against opening an official case about all this. I am still sitting in the kitchen where I slept during the night. In about 1 hour we'll attack Wirisa. Yesterday night, just when we had settled down to sleep, we were called back to the company. A defected Russian lieutenant had reported that early in the coming morning a Russian regiment would launch an attack on Gorky, a little dump of a village which formed part of Lope's defensive zone. Wunsche was ordered to support the company of infantry in that village, while I was recalled to the company and to keep ourselves ready there. Worse than working in the fire brigade. Now I really hope that this crap will end soon. Since today I am finding it hard to find the right kind of enthusiasm for the whole thing. Making personal attacks and launching accusations against me. I will not take it. What a nice 25th birthday that is. Outside it's pouring down in buckets, the roads are totally soaked through, and in addition the local rifle club accuses me of hesitation. No, I will not take this. Soon we are supposed to attack Wirisa. Wonder if the attack will really start, or if we'll just be sitting here again until it gets dark. Everything is possible, and it wouldn't be the first time. My crew just made 2 pans of fried potatoes and another of goulash. The field kitchen has supplied us with the meat. Today we make our food ourselves, and everyone is okay with it. If only we had a few greens to go with it. Boss just returned from the battalion and told us to be ready in 45 minutes. That means eating quickly and maybe closing my eyes for a few minutes. Standing on the road to Wirisa. It is raining. A nice birthday. It will have to be celebrated later. Our artillery is firing, and it is firing too short. My mood is a bit better again. Might be gallows humour. Rudy Schoner is back. He has come to visit us with Glaskin.